I am 21 years old now, and I have come back to the High Lodge in the Ether Range for the first time in 14 years. The road is the same. The stone is the same. The black pines on the western slope have grown taller, but their shape against the sky is the same shape they were when I was 7. The lodge itself sits where it has always sat, 3 low stone halls built into the shoulder of the mountain, slate roofs holding their snow, 4 chimneys with smoke rising at slightly different rates because the kitchen always burned hotter than the long hall. The high country smells in early autumn the way it smelled 14 years ago: cold rock, pine resin, the thin sweet smoke of the seasoning fires they light in the equipment sheds at the first cold nights. I have come back because the man who carried me out of the forest is 60 years old now and lives in the small stone cottage behind the lodge, and I have not seen him since I was 9. My mother visits him once a year on the anniversary of the night he woke up. I have never come with her. I was a child, then a young woman, then someone who could not yet say what I needed to say. Now I am 21, and I have come alone, and I will sit in his small kitchen this evening and tell him what I have understood. But before I do that, I want to put down on paper what I remember, because there are things in this story that no one else has set down, and there are things that no one else can. My mother sat the 7-night vigil beside his cot in the lodge infirmary. The physician kept the medical log. The compact contractor's office kept the casualty record. The Valarian Sovereign Archive holds the formal acknowledgement record entered in my mother's own hand on the 8th morning. None of those records contains what I am about to write, because the only person in the lodge who saw it all and understood none of it at the time was the 7-year-old girl whose body the man covered with his own. His name is Aaron Seville. He was 42 then. He is 60 now. He was a compact ceremonial protection contractor with prior frontier infantry service, scarred jaw, dark hair already graying at the temples, a widower of 11 years with no children of his own. He had been assigned to the autumn riding party as part of a 4-guard rotation, the kind of routine cycle they ran every year when my mother brought me to the lodge for the cold weeks. The protection contract was compact issued at standard frontier rates. He had no formal standing in the Valarian house. He was, in the registry language my mother taught me later, vencompact tavshanari, a compact man under house service, which is a position with no rank, no precedence, no entry in any sovereign acknowledgement record. He had been with the household for 6 months when the ambush happened. He had ridden behind me on the cold weather pony rotations 16 times before that morning. He had said perhaps 300 words to me total, quiet practical sentences about my saddle girth, the weather, where my reins ought to sit. He was not a friend. He was not anyone's friend. He was a contracted guard who watched everything and said little. And what I remember most clearly about him before that morning is that he always checked my cinch twice before I was helped onto the pony, and the second check was for himself, not for me, because he wanted to be certain in his own hands. That morning we rode east of the lodge into the lower forest. My mother and her primary advisor carried Sorrel and Aaron and 3 other guards and me on the small dappled pony I had been allowed to ride that autumn. I was 7. The sky was high pale blue, the kind of blue you only get in the high country in the first cold week before the storms come. The needles under the pony's hooves smelled sharp. I was holding my reins correctly because Aaron had shown me how the previous evening at the equipment sheds, and I had practiced in my room before sleep. The first volley came from the upper ridge. I did not see it. I heard a sound, a soft, wet thumping sound that I did not recognize and would not recognize again until I was much older and saw a documentary about historical bow warfare, and the projectile into leather sound on the screen was the same sound. I remember turning my head toward the ridge because Aaron had turned his head toward the ridge. He was riding directly behind me at no more than half a length, and I remember the moment his body changed shape. The way a person who has been sitting one way becomes a person who is doing something else. He came off his pony in a way I did not understand at 7, and only later understood as a controlled drop calibrated to keep his momentum forward. He hit the ground beside my pony's flank, already moving toward me. He pulled me off the pony in one motion. I remember the air. I remember the strange, weightless second, and put me down on the needles between my pony's body and a fallen log, and then he covered me. He covered me. That is the only word for it. He put his body over my body so that his chest was above my face and his arms were on either side of my head, and his back was the only thing the upper ridge could see. He said one sentence to me. He said, very quietly into the side of my hair, "Stay small." I stayed small. I was 7. I did what I was told. I do not know how long the volley lasted. The medical log later established it as approximately 90 seconds, with the second wave at approximately the 4-minute mark from the first projectile, and the close-range engagement at approximately 7 minutes when the 3 Keth-Voreth operatives came down off the ridge believing the riding party was killed and the principal was retrievable. I learned all of this later. At the time I knew only that the wet thumping sound was happening to the back I was looking up at, that the shape above me did not move, that Aaron's breathing changed in stages, first quick, then slower, then careful in the way a person breathes when they are managing a pain they do not want anyone to know about, and that his arms on either side of my head did not waver. When I was very old enough to read the casualty record, I learned that he took 31 projectile wounds in the first volley, 18 in the second, and that the 3 operatives who came down off the ridge added 11 blade wounds at close range before they were stopped by my mother and 2 surviving guards. The total documented count was 104 wounds. The physician later said the count was approximate because some of the projectile entries had crossed each other and could not be cleanly separated. The casualty record uses the phrase "wounds beyond count" with the conventional notation that the precise number exceeds the scope of useful documentation. The number that gets repeated in the household record, the number my mother uses when she speaks of it at all, is more than 100. I will tell you what I remember from underneath him. I remember that he did not make any sound for the first 3 impacts. The fourth was a small breath, almost a hiss, very controlled, and after that I do not think he allowed himself any sound at all. I remember that his weight increased on me very gradually, a settling, a small lean forward that he kept correcting. I remember that at one point, I think it was after the second volley, in the still time before the operatives came down, he shifted his right arm so that his hand was at the side of my face, palm cupped just above my ear, and I felt his fingers move once, twice, a small reassurance, the kind of thing my father used to do when I was very small and woke in the night. I remember that his hand was warm. I remember that it stayed warm. I remember the close-range engagement only as sound, running footsteps on needles, a shouted Velarian word that I did not know was a command word, until I learned the high tongue years later, my mother's voice giving the same command word in the warrior register. I had never heard her use. The heavy hard sounds of a blade fight on small ground, and Aaron's body above me jerking 3 times in quick succession before going very still. I remember thinking at 7 that he was holding very still on purpose because he had been told to. He had not been told to. He had taken 11 blade wounds in those 3 jerks and was, I learned later from the physician's notes, already in late-stage shock when the 3 operatives were stopped. My mother had killed 2 of them herself. The third surrendered to the guard, who arrived 12 seconds after my mother, and was later questioned at length by the Velarian Interior Service. When my mother lifted Aaron off me, I do not remember the lifting. I remember her face. I remember that her face was a face I had never seen before, not because it was crying, she was not crying, but because it was the face of a person whose composure had become a tool she was using to hold something together. I remember she did not touch me first. She lifted Aaron off me with the help of 2 guards, placed him carefully on his side on the cold needles because his back was the worst of it, and then she looked at me, and I saw her see that I was whole. I saw her face change again. Then she came and gathered me up, and held me with the kind of holding that has nothing to do with comfort, and everything to do with the simple fact of confirming a body is still warm and breathing. She did not let go of me until we reached the lodge. The guards built a stretcher for Aaron from 2 riding coats and the long poles of the cooking fire frame they had brought for the noon meal. The lodge physician, Carith Sorrell, the same Carith who had ridden out with us as advisor, and was also the senior medical officer of the household, gave the orders for carrying him. The pace was the careful pace of people who know that hurry will kill what slow might save. My mother walked beside the stretcher with me in her arms. I was 7 and old enough to walk. She did not let me walk. We reached the lodge at the middle of the afternoon. The infirmary was the small north hall, 2 rooms with 3 cots and a long table and shutters that opened onto the kitchen garden, so that the morning light came in from the east. Carith had us strip Aaron's coat and the underarmor and the shirt beneath in 3 separate motions, the way you do when the layers might be holding the wounds closed and you cannot be sure until you see them. I remember the moment they got the shirt off him. I remember my mother's hand tightening on my arm. I remember a guard going outside to be sick. The wounds were everywhere. That is the only thing a 7-year-old can say. His back from the shoulder to the lower hip was a field of small, terrible marks, and 3 of those marks were larger because the blades had gone deeper at close range. His left arm, where it had been against my head, was wounded along the outer side from elbow to wrist. His right shoulder, where he had shifted to put his hand against my face, was the worst of the close-range wounds. A long blade cut from the top of the shoulder across the collarbone, deep, the kind of wound that bleeds in a way that does not stop on its own. His chest had taken 3 projectiles that had not exited because the underarmor had slowed them. His legs from the thighs down had taken the lower angle of the second volley. Carith turned to my mother and said one sentence, very quiet in the formal physician's register. She said, "Sorving, the count is beyond what I can address without the full station's resources, and the full station is 14 hours away." My mother said, "Then we work with what is here." That was the first decision of the 7 nights. The second was made an hour later when Carith asked, with the same physician's formality, whether the household would authorize species compatibility transfusion under the emergency provision, which would require my mother's signature and the secondary advisor's countersignature, the secondary advisor being Preen Velsorel, who had been left at the lodge that morning to coordinate the evening reception that was now not going to happen. My mother said, "I will sign it, bring me the form." Preen brought the form. He did not countersign immediately. He spoke quietly to my mother in the antechamber outside the infirmary while Carith was beginning the wound triage. I was sitting on a stool just inside the infirmary door, where my mother had placed me with the words, "I want you near me but not in the way," and I could hear them through the antechamber's wood partition. Preen was raising the procedural question that the species compatibility provision had specific consent requirements that the unconscious party could not provide, and that the contracted guard standing of the patient meant that the household carried no formal obligation to extend the provision beyond standard medical care, and that the resources required for the 7-day intensive course of cross-species blood support would draw down the lodge's emergency reserves in a way that would need to be justified to the Interior Service Auditor at the next review. My mother let him finish. Then she said, "Preen," he covered her, "the form is signed, countersign it now." Preen countersigned. I learned later that this exchange, the countersignature given under direct sovereign instruction, the formal provision invoked at the sovereign's own initiative for a non-house contracted party, was the first formal recognition act, though no one in the lodge at the time understood it as such, including my mother. The provision was activated. The cross-species transfusion line was prepared. By the end of the first hour after Aaron's arrival in the infirmary, he was receiving the first of what would be Over the 7 nights, 11 units of compact O-negative crossed with the Valarian Sierra-12 plasma support that the household kept on hand for emergencies, and that no household had ever used before that night for a person of contracted standing. Carith and her 2 junior medics worked through the rest of that afternoon and into the first night. My mother did not leave the infirmary. This is the thing I want to tell you. This is the thing that is not in any record. The medical log notes the physicians present at each hour and the medications administered, and the vital signs and the wound-by-wound triage. The household log notes the meals brought to the infirmary and the bed linen changes. The compact contractor's office record notes only that the patient was in critical condition on day 1 and improving on day 7. None of these records contains the central fact, which is that my mother sat on the small wooden bench beside Aaron's cot from the first hour of the first night to the 7th hour of the 7th morning, and she did not leave. She did not change her clothes for the first 3 days. The cold-weather riding coat she had been wearing in the forest had Aaron's blood on the left shoulder and the front, and she kept wearing it. Preen tried twice to send a household attendant to her with a change of clothes and a warm meal. She accepted the meal at the door of the infirmary and ate it sitting on the bench. She did not change the coat until Carith said quietly on the morning of the 4th day, "Sorvin, the smell is affecting his wound-healing assessments. May I have it laundered?" My mother stood up, removed the coat, handed it to Carith, accepted a clean linen wrap from one of the medics, sat back down on the bench and continued. She did not sleep on any of the 7 nights. She rested. She would lean her head against the cool stone of the infirmary wall behind the bench and close her eyes for periods that the medics later estimated at not more than 40 minutes at a time, 3 or 4 times in each 24-hour cycle. The total sleep across the 7 nights by the medic's best reconstruction was approximately 12 hours. She did not lie down at any point. She brought her work to the bench. She had a leather folio that the household courier brought in twice a day with documents from the capital. She read each document and signed what required signing and dictated brief replies to Preen, who came to the infirmary doorway and took them down. She did not delegate any work to Preen that required her decision. She did not delegate any meeting. The 2 diplomatic exchanges that were scheduled for that week she conducted by formal letter from the bench. The Velkaruth trade delegation, who arrived at the capital expecting an audience with the sovereign, and were redirected to the lodge expecting at minimum a formal reception, were received instead by Preen with the message that the sovereign was attending a personal matter that took precedence and would correspond by letter. The Kethsarian ambassador, who registered displeasure, was answered the same evening by my mother's hand in a letter Preen later told me he still remembers, because the letter said, "Ambassador, my attention is presently committed to a matter of personal recognition. The matter cannot be delegated. I will return to formal court matters when the matter is concluded. Until then, please direct correspondence to Senior Advisor Velsorel, who has my full confidence." The phrase, "a matter of personal recognition," was not formal language. It was not a phrase from any protocol. Preen later told me that he had not known what to do with it the first time he saw it written. He had asked my mother quietly in the antechamber on the 2nd morning whether she meant for that phrase to be entered in the formal sovereign correspondence record. My mother had looked at him and said, "Preen, that is exactly what I meant. Send it as written." She sent it as written. The phrase entered the Valarian Sovereign Correspondence Archive on day 2 of the 7 nights, and it sits there now under the formal heading of Acknowledged Present Sovereign Acts, which is the file class normally reserved for ceremonial recognition orders issued from the throne. No one in the archive on the 2nd day had categorized it that way. By the 8th day, the archive's senior keeper had reclassified it on her own initiative because of where the 7 nights had ended. I was brought to the infirmary on the morning of the 2nd day. I had spent the first night in my own room, with one of the household women sitting by me in case I woke, which I did 3 times. My mother came to me at dawn of the 2nd day, washed and in a clean robe, and sat on the edge of my bed and said, "Vithe, the man who covered you is being looked after by Carith and her medics. He is very hurt. He is alive. I am sitting with him because someone should be sitting with him, and that someone is me. Would you like to come and sit with us for a while this morning?" I said yes. She took me by the hand and walked me to the infirmary. She sat me on the small stool beside the bench, my stool on the side of the cot that was nearest the window, so the light came across my lap and not across Aaron's face. She showed me how to hold my hands in my lap. She told me that Aaron could not see me right now because his body was busy with the work of healing, but that I could sit with him if I wanted, and that sitting was a real kind of being with, and that I should not be afraid of him because he was the same person he had been on the pony the day before. He did not look like the same person. He was bandaged from shoulder to hip across most of his body, his right arm immobilized at the shoulder, his left arm wrapped from elbow to wrist. His face was the only part of him I recognized, and even his face was different and pale in a way that was not the paleness of being indoors, and his lips were a color I had never seen lips be. There was a clear tube going from his arm to a hanging bag of fluid Carith had explained was the blood and plasma support that would help him keep what he needed to keep. I sat on the stool. I held my hands in my lap. I looked at him. I did not know what to do. My mother said very quietly, "Vithe, you can talk to him if you want. He will not answer because his body is busy, but he can hear sometimes in the way that a person sleeping can hear. You may talk to him about anything you want." I did not talk for a long time. My mother did not press me. She sat on the bench with her folio open and worked through correspondence. The small, steady scratch of her pen, the only sound in the room besides the slow, regular tick of the infirmary's wall clock and the soft hiss of the wood stove. At some point, I do not remember how long, I said to him, very small. I stayed small. That was all I said the first morning. My mother did not look up from her folio when I said it, but the scratch of her pen stopped for 1 second and then continued. I was brought to the infirmary every morning of the next 6 days. I sat on the stool. I held my hands in my lap. I told him things, small things, the kind of things a 7-year-old has to say. I told him that the kitchen had baked the spiced rye that he had said he liked, and that I had asked them to save some in the warming pan so it would be ready when he could eat again. I told him that the dappled pony had come back to the lodge stable on its own. All of the ponies had come back, and that the stable men had checked the dappled one for injury and found only a small scrape on the right hock, which they had treated with the brown ointment and which was healing well. I told him about the household's autumn ledger, because my mother let me sit at the small desk in her sitting room in the evenings and copy out the practice ledger for arithmetic, and the practice ledger that week had figures from the kitchen accounts, and I was very proud of having added the column without error. He did not respond. I did not expect him to. My mother had told me that talking to him was a real kind of being with, and I trusted my mother. On the 4th night something happened that I did not understand at the time. I was in my room asleep when the household woman who sat by my bed shook me gently awake and said, "Princess, your mother has asked that you come." It was the middle of the night. I did not ask why. I put my dressing gown on over my night clothes and walked with the woman down the cold stone corridor to the infirmary. Carith was standing by the cot. 2 of the medics were working with quiet, quick hands on Aaron's right shoulder. My mother was sitting on the bench. She turned her head when I came in, gestured me to her, and I climbed onto the bench beside her. She put her arm around me and pulled me close against her side. She did not explain anything. She just held me there. I learned years later from Carith's notes that the 4th night had been the worst. The right shoulder wound had developed an internal bleed that the medics had not been able to stop with the standard means, and there had been a window of perhaps 40 minutes during which Carith had been preparing to tell my mother that the patient was not going to survive the morning. The medics worked through that window. The bleed stopped. The window closed. None of this was visible from where I sat on the bench against my mother's side. What I saw was my mother's face, composed, watching, not interfering, and the slow, steady, careful work of 3 women in plain medical aprons at the cot. I saw my mother's right hand. It was on Aaron's left hand, the one that had been against my head in the forest, the one that had held my reassurance, the one Carith had said could be touched because the wound was not on the palm or the back but along the outer side. My mother's hand was holding his hand. She had her thumb across his knuckles. Her grip was not tight. It was the grip of a person holding another person's hand for the duration of the work. She held his hand from the moment I came into the room until Carith straightened from the cot and said, quietly, in the physician's formal register, "The bleed is stopped. He is stable. We will watch the next hour." My mother said, "Thank you, Carith." She did not let go of his hand. She held it through the next hour while Carith and the medics watched the wound. She held it through what remained of the night while I leaned against her side and slept the second half of the night against her shoulder. I woke at dawn with my cheek against the cool weave of her robe, and her arm still around me, and her right hand still holding Aaron's left hand on the cot. She had not let go in approximately 6 hours. The medics moved very quietly around the cot in those last hours before dawn. They had become used to working with my mother present in the way she was present, not interfering, not asking questions, simply there. Carith had told them at the beginning of the second day that the sovereign was not to be addressed unless she addressed them first, and that her presence in the room was not to alter the work or its pace by any margin at all. They had done their work that way for 4 days. They did it that way through that worst night. The senior junior medic, a woman named Sira Velaroun, told me years later that she had never worked beside such steady silence in her career. She said the silence had not been a sovereign silence. It had been the silence of a person who had decided to be where she was and to stay there for as long as the staying was needed, and that this kind of silence was different from any silence she had encountered in the rest of her medical work. She said it had taught her something about the practice of presence that she had been thinking about ever since. I asked her, in the way a child will ask things at dawn before they remember not to, "Mama, why are you holding his hand?" She said, "Because he held you." I have thought about that exchange every year since. At 7, I understood it in the way a 7-year-old understands things, as a true sentence said in a tone that meant what it said. At 9, I understood it as a transaction, the way children understand fairness. At 13, I understood it as an exchange of debt. At 17, I understood it as a moral statement. At 21, sitting here in the High Lodge writing this with the same autumn light coming through the same shutters, I understand it as something else again. It was not a transaction or a debt or a moral statement. It was an acknowledgement that hands hold what hands hold, and that what his hand had held under the second volley, in the cold needles, with 104 wounds happening to his back, was important enough to be held in return. On the morning of the 7th day, Aaron woke. I was not in the room. My mother had sent me back to my own room 2 hours before dawn to sleep properly, because she had a sense. I did not understand the sense at the time, but Carith has since confirmed she had said the same thing to her, that the morning would be different. Carith had been increasing the rate of consciousness-supporting medication for the past 18 hours, and had told my mother privately that if she was right about the body's response, the patient would surface sometime in the next 12 hours. He surfaced at the 7th hour of the 7th morning. The medics noticed first a change in eye movement under the lids, the small swallow that a person makes when they are coming up from a long depth. Carith was beside the cot within 20 seconds. My mother was on the bench, the folio in her lap, awake, watching. His eyes opened. He looked at the ceiling for what Carith's notes record as approximately 14 seconds. Then he turned his head, slowly and with great care because his neck and shoulders were heavily wrapped, and he looked at my mother. My mother said, "Hello, Aaron." He did not speak for a long time. His throat had been dry for 7 days and his lungs were not yet sure of themselves. Carith gave him a small spoon of water. He swallowed. He looked at my mother again. He said, very rough, very quiet, "The princess." My mother said, "She is well, she is whole. She is asleep in her own room. She has been sitting with you each morning. She told you about the dappled pony who has a scrape on the right hock and is healing. She told you about the spiced rye which has been kept in the warming pan. She wanted you to know." Aaron closed his eyes. A single line of moisture ran from the corner of his left eye down toward his temple. He did not raise his hand to brush it away because his right arm was immobilized and his left was bandaged from elbow to wrist. My mother brushed it away. She did this with the side of her thumb, very lightly, the way a person does when they are concerned not to add any new sensation to a face that has been through enough. He opened his eyes again. He looked at her. He said with the same rough quiet, "I am glad." My mother said, "Aaron Seville." The use of his full name in that register was the first formal Velaryon acknowledged presence address, although neither of them remarked on it in the moment. I did not learn the formal language of the Velaryon acknowledgement system until I was 14, when my mother sat me down in her study and explained the structure of sovereign recognition acts and where they fitted in the household's history. When she explained the first form acknowledged presence address, the use of a person's full name spoken from the sovereign to the named in a tone that carries the weight of formal recognition, I asked her if she had ever spoken it to anyone. She said, "I have spoken it 3 times in my reign. The first was to your father at our betrothal. The second was to my senior advisor when she accepted the position. The third was to Aaron Seville at the 7th hour of the 7th morning at the High Lodge." She had not invoked it as ceremony. She had invoked it as truth. She said the rest of it then. Her voice did not raise. The medics later said they did not realize at the time what they were hearing. She said, "Aaron Seville, my house has seen you. My house names you, and my house will not set you aside." Aaron looked at her for some time. Then he said, very small, the rough still in his voice, "Sorving. I was contracted to keep her whole. I did the contract." My mother said, "Aaron, you did much more than the contract. The contract was for your professional service. What you did was personal. The house has registered the difference. The house will not forget it. I will not forget it." She paused. Then she said, in a tone the medics still remember because it was the first time her voice had any catch in it across the 7 nights, "Aaron, please understand. I sat with you for 7 nights because someone should have, and because the someone was me. I sit with you now because I want to. You are not a contracted guard in my house anymore. You are a person whose body covered my daughter. The 2 things are different. I want you to know that I know the difference. I want you to rest now, knowing that I know." Aaron looked at her. He nodded once, very slight, because that was as much as his neck could do. He went back to sleep. He slept for 14 hours. When he woke again, it was the morning of the 8th day, and I was in the room because my mother had brought me at first light and had said very quietly, "Vithai, he may wake today. I want you to be the second face he sees." I sat on my stool by the window. My mother sat on the bench. When his eyes opened, my mother said, "Aaron, the princess is here. Vithai, would you like to say good morning?" I said, "Good morning." He looked at me. He looked at me for a long time. Then he said with the same rough quiet but stronger now, "Good morning, princess. You stayed small, thank you." I said, "Thank you for staying." It was the first thing I had ever said in my life that I knew at the moment of saying was exactly right. The formal record entry was made later that morning. My mother went to her study, opened the Velaryon Sovereign Acknowledgement Archive in the Household Secure Record Terminal, and entered Aaron Seville's name in the file of acknowledged persons, with the notation that he was named under the first form acknowledged presence address, recognized for an act of personal protection that exceeded the terms of his compact contract by an order of magnitude no formal recognition system would have anticipated. She added a personal note in the comment field, which the archive's senior keeper later told me she had read 3 times before deciding to leave it exactly as written. The note said, "He covered her with his own body for the duration of 2 volleys and a close-range engagement, taking more than 100 wounds without moving. He kept her whole. The house cannot repay such an act, but the house can name it. The house names it." The compact contractor's office was notified by formal letter the same afternoon. Aaron's contract was not terminated. It was reclassified at my mother's direction to a permanent residential position with full lodge benefits and a small stone cottage on the lodge grounds. The cottage he still lives in, the cottage I will sit in this evening. The reclassification was unusual enough that the compact office sent a formal inquiry asking whether the household understood that the contracted guard standing was being elevated outside the standard rate scale. My mother's reply, which I have since read in the archive, said, "Yes, the household understands. The reclassification is intentional. Please file the new contract under permanent acknowledged service and forward the formal letter of recognition to Mr. Seville at his lodge address when he is well enough to read it." Aaron recovered slowly. The right shoulder took the longest. The legs healed first. The back required 2 further surgical procedures and approximately 14 months of physical therapy before he could lift his right arm to shoulder height. He never recovered full range of motion in the right arm. He never recovered the strength on the right side that he had had before the ambush. He was 31 when he stopped being a frontier infantry soldier. He was 42 when he stopped being a working guard. He became, at 43, the permanent resident of the small stone cottage behind the lodge, where he has lived for the past 18 years. He works in the lodge gardens. He keeps the kitchen herb plot, which my mother said was something the household needed, and which everyone in the lodge has known for 18 years is in fact a position invented to give him reason to come to the lodge kitchens for tea every morning and afternoon. He has dinner once a week with Carith, who retired from active medical practice 9 years ago and lives in a cottage 2 doors down. He has dinner once a year with my mother on the anniversary of the 7th morning. She brings the spiced rye herself. She bakes it the day before in our kitchen at the Capitol and carries it to the lodge in a small linen-wrapped bundle. They eat at his small kitchen table. They speak quietly. Carith tells me they laugh. I have not been to one of those dinners. I will not be there tonight either, because tonight is not the anniversary. The anniversary is in 2 weeks, and my mother will come for it. And I have come now precisely because I wanted to come alone before her, because what I have to say to Aaron is mine and not the household's, and I wanted to say it without the weight of my mother's presence in the room. I am going to walk down to his cottage in a few minutes. I am going to sit at the small kitchen table he sets for guests, with the brown enamel kettle that he has used for 30 years before he came here and 18 years since, and I am going to drink the tea he pours. He will ask me about my studies. I am in my 3rd year of public administration at the Capital Institute. He will ask me about my mother. He will tell me what the kitchen herb plot did this summer, the small adjustments he made to the bed where the sage grows because the soil there was draining faster than the rest of it. He will not ask me why I have come. He has never asked me why I do anything. He has known me since I was 7, and he has always assumed that whatever I am doing is the thing I am doing for reasons that are mine. When the tea is done, I am going to say what I have come to say. I have rehearsed it many times. I will not rehearse it here in writing. I will tell him in person. But I will write down what I now understand, which is the thing I came back to put on paper. I understand it now because I have thought about it for 14 years. I did not understand it at 7. I did not understand it at 13 or 17. I understand it now. I understand that what my mother did in the 7 nights was the central act of her reign, and that almost no one knows it. The records that survive describe a sovereign who attended to a wounded contracted guard for a period of 7 days during a personal absence from court duties, and who subsequently issued an unusual recognition order and a permanent residential reclassification. The records do not describe a sovereign who sat on a wooden bench for 7 nights without sleep, who held the hand of a man whose hand had been against her daughter's head, who refused to delegate her work because she would not leave the room, who turned away 2 diplomatic delegations with a single phrase, a matter of personal recognition, that she invented at her bench, and that has since been entered as a formal category in the Velaryon sovereign correspondence taxonomy. I understand that what Aaron did in the forest was the act of a man doing his job, which is the thing he insists when anyone speaks of it. He covered the principle he was contracted to cover. He stayed small with her. He kept his arms on either side of her head. He took the volleys because he was between the volleys and the principle, and that was the geometry of his contract. But I also understand that the geometry of his contract did not require what his hand did when he shifted to put his palm against the side of my face. That was not in the contract. That was not professional protection. That was something else. That was a man comforting a frightened child while his back was being destroyed, because the child was a child and the man was the man he was. My mother understood this. My mother understood it from the moment she saw his body lying on its side on the cold needles, and the way he had been positioned, the way he had positioned himself, to keep me covered until the very end of the engagement. She understood that no contract requires you to put your palm against the side of a child's head while you are being killed. She understood that that gesture was the act of recognition made by him to me before any sovereign recognition act was possible. What she did in the 7 nights was meet that recognition in kind. She gave him her sustained presence. She gave him the hand that had been a sovereign's hand and was, for those nights, simply the hand of a woman whose daughter had been kept whole. She gave him the 7 nights as the only thing she could give that matched, in scale and in sustained attention, what he had given. She did not say this in any record. She did not say it to me until I was old enough to ask. She did not say it to him because she did not need to. He understood it on the 7th morning when she said his name in the first form address and the rest of what she said. He has understood it every year since on the anniversary when she comes with the rye. This is the thing I have come to tell him. I have come to tell him that I understand it now too. I have come to tell him that I have spent 14 years working my way back to that morning, and that I now know what it was that he did, and what it was that my mother did, and that the 2 acts were the same act in 2 registers, and that I am the person who was kept whole by both. I have come to thank him in the only way I now know how to thank him, which is to tell him that I have understood, and that the understanding has shaped who I am becoming. I am going into public administration, because what my mother did at that bench was the work of holding presence in the face of cost, and I want to learn how to do that work in a different register, on a different scale, for the household and the country and the people who are not in any sovereign 7-night vigil, and yet need someone to sit with them. I have come to tell him, you sat with me in the forest for 7 minutes. My mother sat with you in the lodge for 7 nights. I am going to sit with whoever I am asked to sit with, for as long as is needed for the rest of my life. I am going down to the cottage now. The light through the shutter is the same autumn light it was that morning in the infirmary, and the smell coming up from the kitchen is the spiced rye someone has baked because they knew I was coming. The dappled pony from the autumn I was 7 is gone. That pony died of old age 6 years ago, but the line continues. Her great-granddaughter is in the stable now, and her right hock is whole and clean, and the stable men say she has the same calm temperament. Some things continue. Some things are kept. He stayed under me for 7 minutes that lasted my whole life. My mother sat with him for 7 nights that became, in time, the truest thing she ever did. I am 21. I am going to walk down the path now and knock on the small wooden door of his cottage, and drink the tea he pours, and tell him what I have understood. I will close the folio here. The rest is for the kitchen table.